Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise in this House and speak on behalf of the constituents of Calgary Midnapore. And, Madam Speaker, as the Shadow Minister for the Treasury Board, of course, I am also responsible for critiquing this bill and overseeing the debate for the official opposition this evening, and it's a pleasure to do so. Madam Speaker, I'm sure you're aware that S6 is the second piece of legislation relative to regulatory legislation that aims to clean up pieces of legislation, small pieces of legislation throughout a series of departments and ministries that have required these small pieces of legislation to be cleaned up for some time. I'll add, Madam Speaker, as well, that the first was completed before the pandemic. This second one is unfortunately a little behind schedule as a result of the pandemic, but that the government expects to conduct this exercise on a yearly basis. And in the third round, Madam Speaker, what I think is very interesting is that the government will start to consult with outside stakeholders as well. And of course, since on the side of the official opposition, we are always for consultation and transparency with Canadians, Canadians working for themselves, Canadians making decisions for themselves. I certainly would encourage the government to pursue this route of consultation and stakeholder talks in their next round before they proceed to that. But in revision of the S6 document that we have before us today, Madam Speaker, there is one thing that is evident to me, and that is that, and I would say actually throughout all of the correspondence I've received into my House, all of the conversations I've had with my honourable colleagues, all of the debate that we have had in this House, and that is that Canadians are defeated and exhausted, and in this bill, it's easy to see why, Madam Speaker. Canadians are defeated and exhausted, and it's very easy by this bill to see why. First of all, Madam Speaker, as you know, the cost of living has skyrocketed in this country at a time where Canadians need to have measures to reduce their cost of living. I needn't remind you that both rents and mortgages have doubled since 2015, since this government was in power. Food inflation has increased by more than 40%, the fastest pace, in 40 years, up by 10.8%. Some of those items I know you're aware of, Madam Speaker. Butter up by 16.9%, eggs up by 10.9%. Breads, rolls, and buns up 17.6%, and of course, lettuce up by 12.4%, apples up by 11.8%. So really, Madam Speaker, this is a time where Canadians need to have cost of living reductions, and this really means that we need a government that is committed to balancing the budget, lower deficits, and working towards getting rid of our national debt. And this is something that I really don't see this bill working towards, Madam Speaker. I'm sure you are aware, Madam Speaker, that we have over a million Canadians using food banks at this time, 1.5 million, I believe, in fact, and I'm sure everyone saw the social media post, which was very unfortunate, of the Fort York Food Bank and the lineup that was there. So again, Madam Speaker, at a time where we need a government to be thinking about reducing waste, not having red tape and additional measures that will cost more for government and more for Canadians. This government simply does not have that on their mind. And with that, Madam Speaker, I will make reference again to some of the numbers that we see with this government. As President of the Treasury Board, I can tell you that the cost of the public service increased by over 50%, 53% in fact, Madam Speaker, and it's crazy. That's an additional, if you can believe it, $21 billion more that was spent on our public service. And yet we have this cost of living crisis, and yet we have these incredible increases in the public service and in spending. In addition to that, Madam Speaker, I know that you are well aware through transactions that we've had in the House, conversations we've had in the House, that in addition to that $21 billion on public servants, there was also $22 spent on outside consultants. And of course, one of those was McKinsey, a firm that we studied in depth in the committee on which I sit, Government Operations, and which I hope the Transport Committee will finally get an opportunity to discuss after some back and forth between its members relative to the motion they had passed to consider that. So these different types of waste, Madam Speaker, which are evident in S6 at a time really where we need to be thinking about saving money for Canadians and not having these incredible expenses, of course. You know, the federal debt, I'm sure you're aware, Madam Speaker, actually reached $1.22 trillion. That is, of course, $81,000 of debt per household. These are the types of things that we need to focus on, Madam Speaker, and that the deficit for this fiscal year is projected to be $43 billion. I think that's something that we need to really think about, and as well, the deficit for next year is projected to be $40.1 billion. I mean, that's really something, Madam Speaker. If we look at these incredible numbers, our debt to GDP ratio is projected to increase from 42.4% in this fiscal year to 43.5% in the next fiscal year. And, you know, I will say that I think that this is actually something that the finance minister had indicated prior to the budget, that she was going to consider fiscal restraint, and we see anything in this. And again, the result is we end up with a bill like S6 with more.
Honourable member for King's Hands on a point of order.
Speaker, I appreciate that the honourable colleague, and I don't mean to take away from her time, but this is about S6. I've been listening intently for the last few minutes. I don't know what your ruling may be, but it seems to be quite off the mark from the piece of legislation that is actually before the House right now. Maybe you could ask the member if we're able to integrate how her remarks to date actually relate to S6. I would certainly appreciate that.
I think the honourable member has been making references to the bill, from my understanding of the bill, but yes, the honourable member for Edmonton River Brand on the same point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I sat and listened intently to the member from King's Hands speech. He talked a lot about cake. He talked a lot about how he would reference cake.
We're getting into debate. I'm going to give the honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore the opportunity to continue her speech and make the case and the point for the S6.
Certainly. Thank you very much to my colleagues for ensuring that the debate stays relevant, because certainly the amount of money that this government is spending, I think, is critical to every bill. But thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for overseeing that discussion as I continue this interaction here today. So as I was saying, the finance minister indicated that she would use fiscal restraint. I don't believe, in fact, that she did so. And if I can even go further back to when S6 was first being discussed last spring before we broke for the summer recess, it was at that time and even into the fall that the finance minister was indicating that she was going to implement an idea that our leader has committed to, and that is the pay-as-you-go system. So she said she would have fiscal restraint. I don't believe she indicated that at S6 last year at the end of the spring session. This was also being discussed, the pay-as-you-go system, and both of these things don't happen. But also relative to our economy, Madam Speaker, you know, I'll point out a very, I talked about Canadians being frustrated and defeated and exhausted. I'm sure you saw the article in the Globe and Mail today, which indicated that at this point in Canadian history is the lowest time for new business startups, new small business startups, and this very much touches my heart, Madam Speaker. I know you've heard me speak before about how I come from a small business family in Calgary-Midnapore, and that for me, growing up, small business was always front of mind, and this included regulations, something which I believe small businesses will struggle with, these changing regulations as are indicated in S6. And again, if we look across the different departments, we could see how this could possibly happen. So a couple of points there, Madam Speaker, relative to S6. Also, Madam Speaker, I will point out that S6, also relative to this government and the way it legislates and operates in general, their language is consistently filled with jargon, with words and phrases which are difficult for Canadians to interpret. And I started out this speech by talking about how legislation should be for Canadians, that it is the common Canadian that we should be legislating for. And when we have phrases which are complex for Canadians to understand, it doesn't help them, it doesn't empower them, and we need to do that. And with that, Madam Speaker, I'd like to take a moment and talk about the plain language law that we will implement once we are in government, again, in an effort to get government working for Canadians and not have Canadians working for the government, as we are seeing in this case. So I thought that was a very important point to mention. And another place, again, Madam Speaker, as Shadow Minister for the Treasury Board, where I see this take place, is with the public accounts. I think that there needs to be much revision to the public accounts and how they are presented. I don't believe Canadians can understand them in the format that they are in presently. I always share the story that in my home growing up, and a concept we have in our home is a budget is we bring in this much money as a household, we spend this much money as a household, we save this much money as a household, and I don't believe that the public accounts reflect a simple concept such as this, a concept which many Canadian households and many Canadians sitting around the dinner table have to follow. So again, this is relative to the jargon, the lack of plain language, the complexity that we see in regulation, legislation from this government, and is relative, Madam Speaker, to S6. As well, Madam Speaker, we talk about S6 is just indicative of another concept which is very dear to the official opposition day's heart and the heart of that of our leader, and that is getting rid of the gatekeepers. And what that essentially means, Madam Speaker, is just making it easier for Canadians to live, to conduct business, to have the quality of life that they deserve, and which this government is not delivering to them, as is evidenced by some of the earlier indicators that I gave. So, we as the official opposition have provided, I believe, some constructive ideas for getting rid of the gatekeepers. For example, our Opposition Day motion that was presented yesterday talks about getting rid of the municipal gatekeepers, which certainly myself, coming from Calgary, I have had an opportunity to see firsthand at Calgary City Council, and having done some advocacy work at the civic level, I can tell you that all governments must be working together, pulling in the same direction in an effort to provide Canadians with the best standard of living, and that includes housing, especially when we consider the ambitious immigration targets of this government. We need to seriously and sincerely consider how we are going to accommodate all of these newcomers. And again, I say this as an Albertan, as a place of incredible growth, and we are so happy, so many new Canadians, so many Canadians who have abided in other places are making the choice to come to Alberta, but we need to seriously consider how we are going to support our citizens. And so my leader talked about in his Opposition Day motion speech yesterday about how we will incentivize those municipalities that make the decision to build more homes for Canadians, and we will not reward those that do not. And so I think this is an excellent example of where we have to think about the gatekeepers, because again, S6 is just an indicator that there are so many gatekeepers across government when we have to make these minute changes to legislation which seems applicable to, my goodness, ages ago. Things as simple as removing stickers from liquid vending machines. It's astounding to me that these types of things are coming to light now, Madam Speaker. Another example, Madam Speaker, I will give of the Conservative opposition, the official opposition's desire to get rid of the gatekeepers is our unique idea to bring home doctors and nurses to allow for a blue seal in the same way that we have, of course, red seals in the trade professions, and I think that's wonderful. I think it's just fantastic how we have more young people joining the trades. I'm especially excited about more young women joining the trades, and I'm certainly glad to see some of the legislation, even if it's at a provincial level, allowing young women to feel comfortable in joining the trades, whether it's providing safe and clean restrooms for them, or whether it's providing equipment that is suitable for their size and stature, whatever that may be. You know, I think that's just excellent. But what our leader and the official opposition has found that the licensing bodies just create endless barriers and red tape, again, a topic that is talked about much in S6, resulting in an unnecessary, even greater shortage of doctors and nurses. So I like to quote this this sentence from my leader, and that is, the blue seal will mean it won't matter where someone comes from, it matters what they can do. And I think that's just fantastic, and that if these doctors and nurses meet our blue seal standards, they will be able to work in our healthcare system. So again, this is just another example of the Conservative Party and the official opposition looking for true efficiencies. You know, S6 addresses these tiny things, these things which really. I think our energies could be spent on addressing much larger problems and finding efficiencies in these larger problems, rather than, in many cases of S6, providing opportunities for even more legislation through, more legislation through regulation. And, I'll add, Madam Speaker, legislation by regulation hasn't always resulted in the best outcomes for Canadians. I know that as we discuss Bill C-290 in operations, Government Operations Committee right now, we are discussing, for example, the role of the Public Service Integrity Commissioner, and a big discussion around these debates of 290 is really to decide how much leeway we will give the Public Service Integrity Commissioner for leeway in terms of regulation. And these are significant things, Madam Speaker, that touch upon workers that will gravely determine whether a public servant decides to issue agreements, and if they feel comfortable in doing so. And I think that's something very important. Another situation, Madam Speaker, where we saw that regulation was not sufficiently applied, I think, for this official opposition, was the order in council regarding firearms. My goodness, I want to say that was before the pandemic, 3-4 years ago now. So that again was a time where the government took something that most probably should have been legislation, and of course we're going through the C-21 process right now, which the Conservatives oppose, no matter what the wolf in sheep's clothing looks like. We will oppose C-21, but that is an example where regulation was used and perhaps should not have been. Perhaps it should have been left to legislation. So that most definitely is another example of that, Madam Speaker. As well, Madam Speaker, I will say, as I look through these different examples, and there are other examples I know, and my colleagues will talk about them this evening, things that they are very concerned about in terms of interpretations of endangered species, for example. Again, more topics filled with jargon, but they will give their comments as well as to what interpretation of this this legislation will mean through regulation. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, because as I indicated, Madam Speaker, legislation should be made by the people, for the people. This is something that the Conservative, the official opposition, is committed to. I think about how are we going to deal with the complex issues ahead of us, artificial intelligence, if we are talking about liquids coming out of vending machines. But really, S6 brings back to the complexity, the jargon, the gatekeepers of this legislation. We on this side of the House, we want to have legislation who works for every Canadian in every single home. My home, your home, our home. Let's bring it home. Let's reevaluate S6. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.